so noise is any kind of random fluctuation in density on the image. So we have a couple of different things that goes into noise. One is, and we really kind of have talked about both of these, one is fog. So it's most common, especially with thicker tissue types, water-based tissue types. We create, transmit, and report a lot of scatter radiation. So that's going to be your fog. We do have other types of fog as well. So the most common fog is scatter radiation. If you're working on a CR system, the CR systems will pick up background noise in the form of fog on the image receptor. So if you happen to find yourself working with a CR system somewhere, I don't know where you work primarily with CR systems, but if you do, then one of the things that you have to do is, if those image receptors have not been used within 24 hours, you have to take those and you have to run them through the processor to remove the fog. So they pick up a lot of background fog, some from fluorescent lights and just any kind of radiation source. And as we know, building materials, we have radon and all that's going to expose those image receptors, so we have to clear them out. We don't have that problem with DR cassettes, but CR, that is an issue with it. So fog is how we control fog, especially in the DR world, is use proper KVP. We use beam limitation, collimation, something we're kind of unfortunately moving away from, I think, and then grid use. And we're going to talk about each one of those in detail, not necessarily in this chapter, but we're going to get into scatter control in the next section. So scattered X-rays primarily, high KVP contributes to that, and then the structure type. Are you shooting through bone? Are you shooting through soft tissue? What is most likely to transmit that scatter radiation to hit the image receptor? So then we've got quantum Mottle, and we touched on that in the last section as well. Quantum Mottle is just quantum, again, being numbers, and it's a modelly appearance because you don't have enough radiation exposure to the image receptor. So we're going to talk about how we can limit quantum Mottle. I think it's less of an issue than what it used to be. And finally, we've got electronic interference, and that is, I'm not going to say that's not really a DR issue or an imaging issue, but I'm also not going to say it completely is. As the problem with dealing with electronics. So if you have something, like, anybody been back to MRI and looked at the computer screens of MRI? Okay, so sometime if you're back in MRI, make sure you take a look at the computer screens that are right up against the window where they can look in and see the patient. And what you're probably going to see is some sort of distortion on that computer screen. They go to great lengths to try to limit the leakage magnetism, so to speak, out of that room so it doesn't interfere with electronics. But if you look at that computer screen, what you'll see is a black and white computer screen with some colors in it because of that magnetism sometimes that gets out through that window. So you've got electronic interference. Granted, that's MRI, but if you have anything that introduces any kind of electronic interference in your stream of imaging, that could result in some noise on the image. So what quantum Mottle is poor signal strength. It's caused by inadequate radiation striking the image receptor. It has too little mass, but there is a time component. We talked about that in the last section. If you get your exposure time so short that you fall into that reciprocity failure range, then you might not get the mass that you have set. So if you set a mass level of a half a mass with the shortest exposure time you can get, you might not get half mass. Well, what causes quantum Mottle? Lack of mass, right. So in that case, that extremely short exposure time may be the issue. Maybe that half a mass was adequate not to have quantum Mottle, but because of reciprocity failure on that extreme exposure time, you may introduce it. And that used to be demonstrable, I guess is the word, on screens and films a whole lot easier. I think I might have related this story. We were over in Mottle before we moved into this building, and we were still using films. And I was trying to, demonstrate the importance of the red light and not having white light into the room, into the processing room. So what we had over there was film bin. So you open the film bin up, and you pull films out. You open a cassette up, you take the film out of the cassette, you put it in a processor, you put the new film into the cassette, and you close it all up. Under a red light, it didn't fog the film. And I was trying to make the point, before you open the door, make sure you knock, because if that film bin is open and somebody walks in, then that entire film bin is exposed to white light, and it all turns black, okay? More on that here in a minute. But, so I was trying to make the point, knock on the door. So I took film out of the film bin, I put it on top of the countertop, and I turned to the students. I had like 4 students in there. I said, flip the lights as fast as you can. And she was quick. Most of the time people go click, click, and I mean, this was so fast, it was more like a camera flash. It was really, really quick, and it was fluorescent lights, so they didn't come all the way up to full brightness as soon as she flipped them on. But I saw them come on, right? And I just kind of stood there for a second. I was like, I don't know that we got anything off of that, settle down a little bit, But I went ahead and sent it through the processor, and sure enough, she flicked those lights fast enough that it received nothing, all right? So, relate that now to X-ray exposure, and with the X-ray exposure, if the exposure time got so quick that the image receptor couldn't respond to it, then you would either get quantum Mottle or you would get nothing at all, right? We don't really have that with CR and DR now, especially DR. DR is so sensitive that it's going to pick that up, right? So it's because they're so sensitive, it's going to be very difficult to demonstrate quantum Mottle. When we go back through this next year, in spring semester, fall semester. We'll go back through this in fall semester. Y'all gonna have to do experiments where you're gonna take a subject and you're going to have to try to prove or disprove what you've learned about it and what you think you know about it and what you do know about it, right? And one of those things is quantum Mottle. And for the last 2 years, we hadn't had anybody be able to demonstrate quantum Mottle. We're going to talk about the things that will increase your chances of quantum Mottle, and by theory, DR is more likely to introduce quantum Mottle because it requires lower dose radiation than any other image receptor setup that we've had before, and yet we can't demonstrate quantum Mottle. It's difficult to demonstrate quantum Mottle. So theoretically, it should be easy to demonstrate, but it's just not. So it's caused by poor signal strength, and I use the analogy, you're driving down the road and you're listening to the radio, and you leave the area where that radio station is, right? And what you start to get is that breakup of the signal, and it gets staticky. So that's what quantum Mottle is. That's the radio version of what quantum Mottle is. It's poor signal strength causing it to get fuzzy. Visually, what that's going to look like is kind of like speckles on the image. So how you get to quantum Mottle is with two little mats. Well, how do you get to two little mats? KVP, using the 15% rule, if you increase KVP and you want to maintain the same exposure, then what do you have to do with mats? Decrease it, right. So you phototiming, you maximize your KVP on a pediatric patient. Now we're getting into thin anatomy. On a pediatric patient, you increase your KVP to maximum KVP. Why would you want to do that?
Less exposure.
Less exposure, right. So as KVP goes up, you can reduce the mass, get less radiation exposure to the patient. So you got a pediatric patient, you want to lower the dose, you increase the KVP, but what's going to happen with the mass if you phototime?
It's going to go down.
It's going to go as low as it can go, right? So again, we're back to low mass. So high KVP in two cases, if you use the 15% rule, high KVP can introduce quantum model. Also, if you phototime it, if you increase KVP, the likelihood of introducing quantum model increases as well. Thin anatomy, what you need, between a hypersthenic and asthenic patient is less mass, right? That's still the factor that we're going to use to compensate for changes in thickness. So if you have a very thin patient, then it increases the chances of quantum model. So short exposure time, for the reasons I talked about before, and that reciprocity failure might contribute more than just MA does. And then fast image receptor speeds also require less mass. And we're going to get into that in that historical perspective that I was talking about. So quantum model is speckled appearance on the image. Let me see if I can find this real quick. So Bushong, way back in one of the first chapters, refers to quantum model as being kind of analogous to, here we go, that was easy enough. Analogous to watching the rain fall on a sidewalk. So, when it first starts sprinkling, you get that mottly looking appearance, especially out here. Okay, so that's quantum model. I'm going to shut myself up because I hate listening to myself. Almost as much as y'all do, right? So when you're looking at those speckles, it just started sprinkling. You've got the rain on the sidewalk, rain on the driveway. This is coming out of my front door, and this is the driveway here. Then that's kind of what he's referring to. The entire sidewalk is not wet yet, right? So all of your image receptors on your image receptor, each individual, subreceptor has not received the radiation it needs. So what you've got then is that speckly appearance because you've got no exposure or too little exposure through some of those, right? But the more it rains, I think I gotta go to the next one. And this was with my phone. This was before I bought my GoPro. I think there's another one also. But now, it's all gone. So it's rained a little bit more and quantum model's gone. Your entire image receptor is filled with stuff. It's got stuff in it. Now, at the opposite extreme of this, and this is kind of what this is showing really fundamentally, is that you can overexpose to the point that everything looks the same. All right. So, generally speaking, in a reasonable exposure range, you're not going to have a problem with contrast in the digital world. It's not until you really mess something up. You shoot a hand with 500 mass. Regardless of what your KVP is, you hit a hand with 500 mass, and you can kind of think of your individual detectors as kind of like like individual cups of water, right? So if you take a super soaker or water hose and you just start spraying them, then you're going to have different levels of water in each one of those cups, right? But if you spray them long enough, what's going to happen to the cups? All of them completely full. You can't differentiate between them, right? So that is a way that you can lose contrast in a digital world. All right, so it's a speckly appearance on the image. It's caused by poor signal strength. It's caused by inadequate radiation strike in the image receptor, and doesn't quality or quantity doesn't matter in this context. Increase the quality, increases the KVP, and you increase the likelihood that you're going to have quantum model. But just the quality by itself doesn't really have an effect. It's just too few X-ray photons, so too low a mass. So it's caused by high KVP exposure, short exposure times, fast image receptor speeds, and we'll talk about that again here in a minute. Analogous to a noisy TV image. All right, out where I live, we don't have cable. And we've been doing without satellite TV for long enough that just a flat panel antenna is, the difference between if you've got cable or, let's say, DirecTV, your TV surfing experience and mine is I only have to go through 20 channels before I know that there's nothing on TV. Some of y'all gotta go through 400 channels, right? So it's efficient, it's more efficient. So, but the downside is that every time the wind blows, I start losing reception. All right, so again, I don't get strong enough reception, I lose image, and basically what I've got again is a TV version of quantum model. So how we battle that is with lower KVP, higher mass, and slower image receptors. Of those three, that's slower image receptors is really the worst option of those things. And because of the reasons I'll talk about here in a minute, slower image receptors require a higher dose of radiation, which is going to increase patient exposure. So rules for minimizing quantum exposure, or quantum model, is the speed of the image receptor. So slower image receptors require more mass. Since they require more mass, they're less likely to show quantum model, and they have a low noise to signal ratio. So they're not as noisy. They tend to be higher resolution, less likely to show quantum model. Fast image receptors, on the other hand, require less mass, and because they require less mass, are more likely to show quantum model and have higher noise to signal ratio. So more noise with the faster image receptors. All right, so what that means is that if you're making exposure on, these are relative numbers, and these are the numbers we used to use in screens and films. If you're shooting on a 200 speed system versus a 400 speed system, the 400 speed system is twice as fast as a 200 speed system. Okay? The numbers are relative. So if you had a 100 speed system and a 400 speed system, that means the 400 speed system is 4 times as fast, right? So the speed of the image receptor system tells you how much radiation exposure you need to get a good exposure. So let's say you made a perfect exposure on a 400 speed system. You switch to a 100 speed system, what are you going to have to do with your technique? You're going to have to increase it by a factor of 4. Right. So going in the opposite direction, you make a perfect exposure on a 100 speed system, and you increase to a 400 speed system, what are you going to have to do with your technique? You're going to have to decrease it by a factor of 4, right? So specifically what we're going to decrease is mass, and now we've got 1/4 the mass, and we can introduce the possibility of quantum model. Now, screens and films were at 400 speed, okay? Once we switched over to CR dropped to 200 speed. So for each exposure, what we had to do was increase our mass by a factor of 2, okay? The alternative there is to not increase the mass, but what else could you change to increase image receptor exposure by a factor of 2? Is that? KVP by a factor of 15%, right? So we could increase KVP by 15%. What happened whenever we changed from screens and films to CR is, again, we got better contrast resolution. So with that better contrast resolution, and with our system controlling our contrast, then what we get then is the ability to increase KVP without it affecting the image really much at all. So instead of increasing mass by a factor of 2, what we did was we increased KVP by 15%. Okay? Now, once we went to DR, DR was the same speed as screens and films. So did we decrease our KVP back down by 15%? No, because still what controls your contrast now is a computer and not your technical factors. We could keep that that KVP high and reduce instead our mass. So what happened to patient exposure when we went from screens and films to CR? We increased our KVP and we did nothing with our mass. For every single exposure, we got an increase in patient exposure, patient dose, right. The possibility to reduce the overall patient dose went down because of fewer repeats because of technique, but for every single exposure it went up, maybe 30%. Now, when we switched over to DR and we could reduce our mass instead of changing our KVP back down, now what happened to patient dose?
Goes down.
It goes down. It's even less now than what it was with screens and films. Okay, but the payout on that, or the downside of that, is that we were less likely to show quantum Mottle. I think we've kind of moved past that at this point, and we're quantum Mottle may be a thing more of a thing of the past. Okay, so still though we have to teach it as if, you know, quantum Mottle's still a big thing. When I was a kid, you know, all the cartoons, you were scared, terrified of quicksand, you know, because quicksand was in every cartoon. You know, every cartoon character fell into quicksand. Anybody ever fallen in quicksand? You have, no kidding.
We had springs at our house.
Okay, okay. So how far did you sink though?
Not very far, I was little.
Yeah,
My parents lived like
yeah.
that.
So, you know, quicksand, you know, if you find yourself in quicksand, you're probably gonna lose a shoe, and that's about it. You know, it's just not that deep. But quantum Mottle's kind of the boogeyman of fast image receptor speeds, kind of like what quicksand was, you know, back then. It's just not that, you know, we have to talk about it, but it's, you know, not as dominant as what it would appear, the amount of time that we have to spend on it. So things that cause quantum Mottle, I almost said quicksand, quantum Mottle, things that cause quantum Mottle, we have to consider each one of those things and, you know, limit those things that would cause quantum Mottle. So KVP. So if we increase KVP, we reduce mass, introduce possibility of quantum Mottle, right? So what we want to use is optimum KVP. You want to use as high a KVP as you can use and not introduce quantum Mottle. But we have optimum levels of KVP. Like, what do you shoot for a chest X-ray now? KVP wise. What's that? 110, 120 KVP, very high KVP, really kind of high KVP anyway. How about for a KUB?
85.
80, 85, yeah. So think about those structures though, you know. You've got chest X-ray, which is primarily air, right? And then you've got the abdomen, which is solid organ system, right? So why high KVP for chest X-ray?
Distance.
A distance could be beneficial, yes. As we increase our distance, you know, our options are to increase KVP or increase mass. Increased mass, we've got more heat generated, right? But what else? It doesn't really do anything on the image. You can shoot a chest X-ray with 80 KVP all day long, and as long as you're processing it under a chest X-ray algorithm, that's what it's going to look like. Chest X-ray, right? Or you could shoot ribs with 110 KVP, and as long as you're processing under ribs, what's it going to look like? Ribs, right. So the KVP is really kind of a throwback to screens and films, where KVP truly was what controlled your contrast on the image. It still controls penetration. What you're trying to in chest X-rays, the reason we used high KVP was we want to penetrate those ribs at a greater rate so that we could see any kind of pathology behind them. If we used low KVP, then the contrast will be too high and we might not be able to visualize things behind the heart, maybe not behind the ribs too, okay? So that doesn't really apply that much anymore. And for that reason, you know, the KVP, the relationship between KVP and contrast, for that reason, I do believe sooner or later you're gonna start using KVP more so than what you do mass to adjust for patient thickness. All right? But in context to quantum model, KVP, as you increase your KVP, if you increase KVP and reduce mass, you introduce the possibility of quantum model. Mass, well, you know, we just talked about a portion of that. But when you're phototiming, you got a couple of things to consider there. One is that high KVP, which would naturally drive your mass down. But also when you're phototiming, when you're, you know, selecting the photocells, putting the proper anatomy over that photocell. You know, if you shot a chest x-ray, well, maybe chest x-ray is not a good example. Maybe a KUB, all right? Let's say your photocell is this big, okay? And you make your exposure with your L-spine directly over it, then that's the only photocell you use. Is your photocell covering the L-spine? The answer is yeah. So your X-ray beam has to go through the L-spine to get to this, right? All the soft tissue too, but it's got to go through the L-spine in order to get to the radiation detector. And you're going to have adequate exposure. Now, what if you off-centered a little bit? What's now striking the image receptor? What does the X-ray beam have to go through now to get to the image receptor? Yeah. Well, if we're shooting the L-spine, it's just a soft tissue, including a lot of you know, a lot of scatter radiation is going to strike the the photocell as well, right? So, are we going to limit our exposure time and therefore our mass by putting the anatomy of interest over the photocell, or off-centering? Over it, right. So accurate positioning also helps to prevent quantum model whenever you phototime. Make sure you select the proper cell. Make sure that proper cell, you know, your anatomy of interest is over that cell. So it's all about mass, quantum modeling.